G'day everyone, welcome back to another Tips and Talks Tuesday. Today we are doing a first impressions video on this right here. It's the new scope that I've been running on and off the 223. It's a MEOPTA OPTIKA 6, 4.5 to 27 by 50. First focal plane MRAD1 reticle. So I've just got a bit of a list here on my phone of some pros and cons. It's just going to be a first impressions. It's not going to be a super in-depth review. I've only had it for I think a bit over a week or 2 weeks now, so I just want to give my first thoughts on it, and we'll go on from there with the proper review down the track. So the first pro is glass quality. Yesterday afternoon I was shooting some rabbits in some low light. Well, there was one rabbit in very low light, and I ran the illumination on. I think I shot it at about 15 power, and I was extremely impressed with the light gathering capabilities of this scope. I feel like I would happily have this scope on a deer rifle. It was very, very impressive. I think it would compare quite well against some higher end scopes. The second I've got on the pros is these locking turrets. So they're just a lift, turn, drop it back down. So really like that function. There's no slipping of it like now. You've got to actually lift it up before you turn your turret, and then it locks back down. Talking about turrets, the zero stop. So you can hear bang, bang, right on that zero stop. The zero stop was easy to set. I videoed that. Yeah, you can just see it's a solid stop there. As well as the zero stop, another pro I had was the very audible and positive clicks. So I'm sure you should be able to hear this pretty easily. So very audible, very positive, you know exactly where you're at. While we're also talking about the turret, I just want to mention that the fact that each number and the lines, the markings, actually line up. Seriously? While we're talking about the turrets, I just want to mention that each of these markings actually lines up with the line on the scope body, so you know exactly where you're at. You know whether you're at 1 mil or 1.1 mil or 1.2 or whatever you're at, you know exactly where you are. It's not that line isn't sort of in between the markings, it's bang on. So I really like that. Next pro I've got on the list is the reticle, the MRAD1 reticle, which was designed by Dark Lord of Optics. This reticle is absolutely awesome. I was a little bit hesitant at first, and even when I first ordered this scope with this reticle, Gadget called me up and he's like, "Oi man, are you sure that's the reticle you want?" I said, "Yeah, that's the reticle I want to try out." This reticle is absolutely brilliant. Probably, I'd say it's up there with my favorite reticle I've ever used. I kind of wish more other manufacturers had this reticle in their scopes because it is that good. So it's got a big horseshoe. You can use it on any zoom range. I'm a big fan. Next pro, first focal plane. So that really good MRAD1 reticle is usable on all zoom ranges. Nothing gets changed. Like none of your markings or anything like that in your reticle change. So whatever zoom range you're on, 1 mil in the reticle is 1 mil. So that's a big positive for me. I used to always like second focal plane scopes where the reticle would stay the same size throughout the zoom range. But now I'm 100% a first focal plane convert, and I will probably never buy a second focal plane scope ever again. So I really like that. Next pro is the illumination. It's got stops in between, extremely bright. I used it yesterday afternoon on one of those rabbits and I was impressed. I like what gets lit up on the illumination. It's not a heap. It's just enough so you can use it on all zoom ranges. Having the stops in between, it's definitely my preferred way to have an illumination set up. So the illumination comes on when you're on a number, and then if you're on the dot, you're off. But it's got stops in between every brightness setting. Yeah, I really was a fan of that illumination. Another pro is this big, beefy zoom ring. Super easy to grab onto and turn. Super easy. Even without the throw lever, they've got this big sort of knurled part here. It's just absolutely beautiful. Nice and smooth, very easy to adjust. Really like this zoom ring. The only thing you may have issues with is if you've got a really high bolt lift, you may hit the zoom ring. So something to consider, but I don't have any of those problems. Next pro, I'll try and get in on there. The throw lever is provided, and it's got multiple points where you can actually put the throw lever. So big positive on that. I like having a throw lever on my scope. I like just being able to crank it up to max or crank it back down. So just run my thumb whatever way. Very easy. Next pro, the windage turret markings run from left to right. So when you're adjusting it like this, instead of it going all the way around from say 1 to 10 or whatever it would be, it is 1 right, 1 left. A lot of scopes haven't worked this out, that it should be 1 right, 1 left, 2 right, 2 left, etc. Not 1 all the way around to whatever number they're finishing on. So really good to see that MEOPTA ran it with it this way. Super easy to get it back to 0. And that way, if you want to dial your wind, you know exactly where you're at. Finally, on my pros list, I've got that it seems to track well. All the reviews I've watched on these scopes, they've tracked well, and it seems to hold 0. Even last Tuesday when I did the last video where I was taking it on and off and shooting in between, admittedly the groups weren't brilliant, but they were very consistent. A lot of that could have been shooter error or, you know, my shooting position off that silly gun bag that I was using as a rear rest. But all in all, this seems to be shooting very well, consistent and accurately. It seems to be holding 0, and I'm pretty hard on gear. Anyone that knows me knows that these guns and scopes, for instance, get thrown around in the car and bashed around out in the farm. I don't take great care of my stuff, so they need to be able to last, they need to be able to be tough, they need to be able to hold 0. So far, so good, but we'll give it a few more months and then we'll see how it fares up in the proper review, but things looking good. Now onto the cons. I've probably missed something on the pros, but we're just going to run onto the cons. The very first con, and I noticed it straight away the second I got the scope, is this glass in this scope has very bad chromatic aberration and purple fringing. So when you're looking at any sort of bright light or even in the sky, if you've got a change in color, something generally dark to light, there's just like this crazy purple hue. It's like this purple fringing on the edge of it, and you generally notice it. Same thing on cameras. You notice on cameras with cheaper lenses. I noticed it extremely badly in this scope, which says to me the lenses aren't great. The glass quality just isn't quite there compared to the higher end scopes. It's not a deal breaker. I did mention before in the pros about how good this scope was on the last light, but it's basically like an optical distortion within the lenses, and it is pretty bad on this scope. Very noticeable, and something that I'm not a big fan of, but I will deal with it. It's only on a 223. I think it would probably annoy me a little bit more if this was on, you know, a really high-end rifle. I don't know if I would put this scope on a really high-end rifle because it would just feel too cheap for me. But all in all, I think that it's the main con that I found with this scope, that's for sure. The second con for this scope is no capped windage turret, and the windage turret doesn't lock. It's not a deal breaker, but for me, especially the first focal plane scope, it just makes way more sense to have a capped windage turret. They have a capped windage turret on their 3-18 by 50 and 3-18 by 56, but on this model they didn't have a capped windage turret, and it doesn't lock. So even though the clicks are positive and you shouldn't accidentally knock it, it is possible that it's going to happen. So definitely something for the cons list. Like I said, not a deal breaker, but I kind of wish that there was a cap, or at least these turrets here on the windage locked. Another con, even though I was glad MEOPTA included a throw lever with this scope, the throw lever is plastic. Was a little bit concerning, plastic the whole way, so the thread and everything. I kind of wish that had been metal or something a little bit more durable. It doesn't feel like it's going to break or anything. It feels pretty solid, but I still would have been happier if it had been metal. And finally on the cons list, no flip up scope rings or caps. So it came with a bikini cover, but that was all. So it doesn't have flip up eye caps or anything, which quite a few scope manufacturers are doing now. I appreciate flip up eye caps. Just helps stop getting crap and that into your scope, and they're quick and easy to take on and off. It's good that it included the bikini cover, but I feel like flip up eye covers would have been better. So anyway, to summarise, I feel like this scope is extremely good value for money. I did buy this scope with my own money. I don't regret buying it. I think it's probably the perfect scope for my 223 as a daytime scope, and I'd also be able to easily spotlight with this scope as well. That's why I wanted that zoom range. The 4.5 to 27 gives you a lot of reach if you want to be taking longer shots, but it also gives you 4.5 powers, pretty damn good for things like spotlighting and if you're doing any close range stuff. So I feel like it's a good zoom range. Everything, all in all, seems to be going pretty well. It'll be interesting to see how it lasts, like over time, whether it still continues to hold zero and shoot consistently and all those things. But I think all in all, good value for money and worth a look if you're in the market for a scope in this sort of price range.